Abraham Lincoln read Karl Marx. Yes, you heard that right. In 1864, following Abraham Lincoln's re-election victory during the Civil War, Karl Marx, writing from England, sent a letter to the US President on behalf of the International Working Men's Association. "We congratulate the American people upon your re-election by a large majority," Marx wrote to Lincoln. "If resistance to slave power was the reserved watchword of your first election, the triumphant war cry of your re-election is, 'Death to slavery.'" The letter concluded, "The working men of Europe feel sure that, as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes." Marx would eventually receive a reply from the American ambassador for the UK, Charles Francis Adams. The ambassador claimed that the president warmly received the letter, and that he wanted to prove himself not unworthy of the confidence which has been recently extended to him by his fellow citizens and by so many of the friends of humanity and progress throughout the world. Beyond Ambassador Adams' claims that Lincoln read the letter from the International Working Men's Association, there's no definitive proof that Lincoln actually did, but there's almost no doubt that the great emancipator read Karl Marx extensively. Marx today is of course more famous for the Communist Manifesto and his magnum opus Capital, but the German philosopher's largest body of work comprises the articles he wrote as a foreign correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune, which was the unofficial newspaper for the Republican Party before the outbreak of the Civil War. Marx had published at least 350 articles in the Tribune, which gave him at the time a larger readership than anything else he had written. The Republican-affiliated Tribune had about 200,000 subscribers in 1855, twice that of the London Times during this period. Lincoln, like many other of his fellow Republicans that read the Tribune on a regular basis, it is more than likely that he studied and was influenced by Marx's essays. It may come as a shock to many viewers that Karl Marx's largest body of work was for a newspaper associated with the Republican Party, which is especially ironic now when the GOP has gone far right and reactionary. It may also be a surprise that Marx took a keen interest in America, but the communist philosopher, during and after the Civil War, firmly believed that the United States could be one of the first true socialist states in the world. It's easy to imagine why this is not common knowledge. One obvious reason why even many contemporary leftists aren't aware of Marx's interest in the US is that his more famous Communist Manifesto focuses more exclusively on Europe. And in general, it can be argued that prior to the Civil War, Marx's feelings about the revolutionary potential of Americans were much more mixed. On one hand, Marx was impressed by the potential of some of the leftist political parties in the US, which was at least somewhat more democratic than the monarchies of Europe, with at least white males having the suffrage. The existence since 1820s of the working men's parties in New York City and Philadelphia was also a cause of optimism. There were some of the first labor parties anywhere in the world, and Marx acknowledged their significance, stating in reference to these groups that Americans have had their own socialist democratic schools since 1829. On the other hand, Marx in his early years remained cautious of becoming too excited by the prospect of socialism taking root in the United States. Slavery still persisted, and white settlers were expanding westward into new territories stolen from Native Americans. Marx believed that if such conditions remained, in other words, as long as white Americans saw owning slaves and colonizing the new frontier as their way of achieving prosperity, the working class in the US would be incapable of waging class warfare. There would be no inclination among them to enact a revolution. This, in Marx's own words, made for a bourgeois society that was still far too immature for the class struggle to be made perceptible and comprehensible. In this conclusion, Marx agreed with Hegel, another great German philosopher who had been one of Marx's early influences. Hegel had written that the constant flow of people to the plains of the Mississippi overcomes unrest at its principal sources and stabilizes existing conditions. However, the abolitionist movement and the outbreak of the Civil War marked an important turning point for Marx in his perception of the US. He became more optimistic that America could in fact become a socialist country. If slavery could be abolished, and if the westward expansion could be halted, the conditions that had prevented the working class from revolting would also be upended. With these hindrances removed, socialism or communism could take root. After the abolitionist John Brown's famous raid to liberate slaves at Harper's Ferry, Marx wrote to his comrade Frederick Engels that the most momentous thing happening in the world today is the slave movement. When the Civil War finally broke out, Marx viewed it as a class conflict between the highest form of popular self-government till now realized against the meanest and most shameless form of man's enslaving recorded in the annals of history. Marx also admired Lincoln, describing him as the single-minded son of the working class. Long after the Civil War, when he was nearing the end of his life, Marx remained hopeful about America's potential to become one of the world's first socialist countries. Following the Great Railroad Strike in 1877, when 100,000 workers across America walked out of their jobs, Marx called it the first great uprising against the oligarchy of capital which had developed since the Civil War. He also said that in comparison to their European counterparts, the American masses are quicker and have greater political means in their hands to resent the form of progress accomplished at their expense. In his early years, Marx thought about moving to the US, to Texas in fact, and even later in his life, he considered moving the International Working Men's Association to New York City, but he died in 1883 before ever even visiting the United States. Marx's unfulfilled ambition to visit the US was, however, realized by his friend and co-author of the Communist Manifesto, Friedrich Engels, who made a trip in 1888. Like Marx, Engels became hopeful of America's revolutionary potential. "Unless I am greatly mistaken," he wrote, "the Americans will astonish us all by the magnitude of their movement." Engels' aspiration for the United States grew into a conviction that the nation could even transition to socialism, and that such a transition would be through more peaceful means than that of more backward feudalistic societies like Tsarist Russia. "It stands to reason," he wrote in 1893, "that the change in Russia must be far more violent, far more incisive, and accompanied by greater suffering than it can be in America." But more than 140 years after his death, the United States has yet to undergo the revolutionary change that Marx foresaw. This, of course, then begs the question, was Karl Marx wrong in believing that socialism could take root in the United States? After all, unlike many European countries today that have vibrant social democratic political parties, or Latin America which has elected various democratic socialists as heads of state, the United States has never really had a leftist national government. There are now only two major political parties, both of which are led by stalwart defenders of capitalism. "We're capitalists," said former Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi at a CNN town hall. "That's just the way it is," she added, as though to forestall any doubts. But I believe Karl Marx will eventually be proven correct. Based on, and expanding upon, the conditions he laid out, the US may very well either vote in a socialist government or, short of that, wage a revolution that will overthrow the capitalist order. First, there's public opinion. Recent polling has shown that young millennials and Gen Z Americans have a positive view of socialism. Democratic voters across all age groups have never been more pessimistic about capitalism. Labor unions have seen a surge of approval from the population. The most popular sitting US Senator is the self-avowed Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders, with his successor, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as a potential frontrunner in the next presidential election in 2028. On top of that, even a large majority of Republican voters now view corporations and banks negatively. Whether they like it or not, both political parties will need to adopt at least something of an anti-capitalist stance if they hope to win in future elections. We have already seen right-wingers like Donald Trump playing lip service to anti-elitist themes. During the 2016 presidential election, his attacks on his opponent Hillary Clinton were often about her being a stooge of Wall Street. And for the upcoming midterm election in 2026, many Democratic incumbent members of Congress are facing primary challengers from the left, with some of them being socialists as well. If the left can take over the Democratic Party and win their agenda through elections, this may eventually open the door for America to transition away from neoliberal capitalism to at least a form of social democracy, just as Friedrich Engels predicted that socialism could take root in this country through more peaceful and less violent means. The growing antagonism towards the rich and elites from registered voters of both political parties leads us to the second reason why the United States could become socialist. The Marxist argument that people are more willing to rebel if there are no means of achieving prosperity by attaining private property. As I mentioned, Marx thought that slavery and westward expansion were hindrances to a socialist revolution. As long as these practices persisted, the white working class would view them, and not class warfare, as their means of achieving the quote-unquote American dream. If Americans viewed attaining private property as their ticket to wealth and security, they would not be willing to take a risk and wage a rebellion against the capitalist order. The white working class believed in the promise that they, too, could be part of the bourgeoisie. And this created the condition in America under which, as Engels observed, everyone could become, if not a capitalist, at all events an independent man, producing and trading with his own means of his own account. This factor is one of the key reasons why there was no socialist revolution in America during the 20th century. Even with the end of westward expansion, there was still, at least, a vibrant middle class that had a means of acquiring abundant and affordable suburban housing. During and right after the New Deal era, it still felt as if capitalism was working. However, since the 2008 Great Recession, young Americans can no longer afford to buy new homes, nor do many of them even have the means to pay rent in the cities. Not since the Great Depression of the 1930s have so many young adults moved back in with their parents. In just 15 years, the average age of the US homebuyer went from 39 to 59 years old. And there is increasing awareness that those responsible for the current crisis are the venture capitalists and the private equity firms that spent billions buying up foreclosed homes after the financial crash and selling them back to the market with jacked up prices. But if Marx was right, it is to their own peril that these capitalists think they can continue taking advantage of the current economic system. The bourgeoisie, he wrote in the Communist Manifesto, are its own gravediggers. If young adults can't afford to buy homes and live independently, they will be forced to survive in squalor in crammed apartments with 3, 4, 5 or more roommates. When the working classes are jam-packed in crowded spaces, it not only creates discontent against the economic system, but also solidarity with the workers they are living with. They start to share radical ideas with each other. They see that their hardships are not their own individual failures, but rather realize that this is a common condition of a system exploiting them all. The absence of affordable private property deepens class divides and agitates the working class. As the founding father James Madison warned in the Federalist Papers, the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. This is why we have recently seen left-leaning politicians winning important elections, particularly in the cities where rent is unaffordable. New York City, for instance, now has Democratic Socialists representing them in city government as well as in Congress. This should come to no surprise, but rather a bellwether for things to come. The third reason why I believe Marx was correct has to do with more recent transformations in the economic system, particularly in the rapid rise of AI technology, which may well help to bring about the collapse of capitalism. Now, viewers might instinctively reject the idea that Marx had anything to say about AI. After all, he lived a century before the advent of the computer. But the communist philosopher did have a lot to say about automation and what we would consider robotics replacing workers. Once adopted into the production process of capital, Marx wrote, "The means of labor passes through a different metamorphosis, whose culmination is the machine, or rather, an automatic system of machinery. The workers themselves are cast as merely as its conscious linkages." 20th century Marxist economists, such as Louis Corey, expanded on Marx's prediction for societies where machines replace human workers. In his book, The Decline of American Capitalism, written during the Great Depression, Corey warned that the replacement of human workers by machines would create an economic death spiral. Unemployment would increase, spending would decrease, the capitalists would see their profits dry up as no one could afford their products, the economic system would implode. Consumption is necessary to production, Corey wrote, but capitalism limits the wages and consumptions of the workers, thus creating cyclical crises and breakdowns. Corey also wrote that the machine is an arrogant monster that seeks to be sufficient unto itself to displace the human worker. There can be little doubt that he and Marx would have seen AI as an equal if not greater threat. The replacement of humans with AI has already led to one of the worst unemployment crises in America since the Great Recession of 2008. The situation has hit college graduates particularly hard, with only 30% of 2025 graduates now saying that they have secured a full-time job in their field. And this is a perfect recipe for revolution. While Karl Marx believed that class struggle must be led by the proletariat, his left-wing political rival, the anarchist philosopher Mikhail Bakunin, argued that the critical role would also be played by what he called the déclassé intellectuals. What Bakunin meant by déclassé intellectuals were, essentially, young, college-educated workers who were unable to survive in the current capitalist system. Whether they are PhD graduates working for minimum wage in fast food restaurants, nurses living in their parents' basement, or teachers that moonlight as bartenders to make ends meet. It was a body of educated individuals who would not, nor, indeed, could not, be told that their lack of success was due to their own liabilities. And so we see it is the gentrified areas of New York City that voted to elect democratic socialists like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Zohran Mamdani. Neighborhoods such as Astoria in Queens or Bushwick in Brooklyn are filled with what Bakunin would have called déclassé intellectuals. Young, white, college graduates who may have come from middle-class parents, but have been oppressed by the capitalists who have made them live in poverty or near poverty. They are not what Marx and Engels called the lumpen proletariat, a lower class that lacks class consciousness. The déclassé intellectuals have their eyes wide open and are ready for the revolution. In addition to the shift in public opinion and the current crisis of capitalism, there is a final reason why I believe that the United States could turn into a socialist country as Marx thought was possible. Despite the bitter disgust with which many politicians and members of the media pronounce the word, socialism is in fact quite American. The habitual opprobrium evoked by the socialist label belies the fact that for a long time, the US has already accepted the key tenets of Marxism without being aware of it. For instance, a 2010 survey conducted by the educational nonprofit, the Bill of Rights Institute, found that 42% of Americans mistakenly thought that Marx's famous communist slogan, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs," was actually a part of the US's Constitution's Bill of Rights. These results are consistent with an earlier study conducted in the late 1980s that also found that almost half of the population believed that the Marxist slogan was in the Constitution. Of course, one could say that these findings merely show that at least half of the country is incredibly ignorant. It becomes more of an indictment of the education system than an endorsement of Marxist principles. But if we posit the idea that people are not as stupid as some would like to think, then their incorrect response deserves another look. The phrase, "from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs," expresses the common sense idea that everyone has the duty to contribute to society based on their abilities, and that society should tend to the needs of its members. It evokes an honored notion of responsibility, compassion, and fairness. Seen in this light, it is no wonder that half of Americans attributed this maxim to its most cherished foundational document. Before brushing off these incorrect respondents as just being uneducated, perhaps we should credit them for recognizing that the quote from Marx clicks with the virtues and aspirations laid out by the founding fathers. Certainly, many of the founding fathers were nowhere near being left-wing. After all, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner and John Adams had authoritarian tendencies. But Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, was in fact a sort of proto-Marxist socialist. In his pamphlet, Agrarian Justice, Paine argued for a national basic income as well as guaranteed pension for older citizens. Paine was not only an early pioneer of the welfare state, he was also one of the first prominent abolitionists in America. In his essay, African Slavery in America, published in 1775, he argued that slaves should be freed and have the right to enjoy the fruits of their labor at their own disposal. In a similar way, Marx argued that workers should own the means of production. Perhaps one could argue that, because of the tainted legacy of the Cold War and the Red Scare, Americans may be ready to accept the ideas of Marxism, but not the label or Karl Marx demand. In other words, Marxism has an image problem. If a rebranding is necessary, I say we look no further than the wisdom of Thomas Paine to Americanize socialism. So rather than echoing Marx's proclamation that workers, quote-unquote, have a world to win, we can simply call for the proletarian revolution with what Paine wrote in Common Sense. We have it in our power to begin the world over again.